Hi everyone, with the season wrapping up, I want to go ahead and do a series of two videos. I'm going to start with this one, the top 5 most disappointing teams in the NFL this year. Here's the criteria that I'm using. 1, it has to be one of the teams that didn't make the playoffs. If they're in the playoffs, there's no reason to put them on a list of the top 5 most disappointing teams in the NFL. And 2, it has to be a team that was expected to make a run for the playoffs and didn't make it, or it has to be a team that was expected to be a borderline playoff team but fell far from it. And so with that in mind, here are who I believe are the 5 most disappointing teams in the league for 2024. Number 5, the Cincinnati Bengals. The Cincinnati Bengals last year barely missed the playoffs after Joe Burrow was out for the most crucial parts of the season. With Joe Burrow back, it was expected that the Bengals would take the next leap forward, with many even thinking that they would knock the Chiefs out of the Super Bowl. However, what happened was nowhere near what was expected, because the Bengals had a hard time getting out of the gate. The first game of the season, the Bengals end up losing to one of the worst teams of the year in the Patriots. They go 0-2, and by the time there was only 5 games left of the season, the Bengals were 4-8. Now, luckily for themselves, they ran the table, got a 9-8 season, but it was too late. The Broncos were able to wrap up a spot by beating basically a team of backups for the Chiefs. And the Bengals missed the playoffs. And the sad thing for the Bengals is that they would have had a chance had they not lost in the first game to the Patriots. I'm a Patriots fan, and I'm wondering how in the hell we managed to beat the Bengals in round 1 when the Bengals were clearly better. But anyway, 5th most disappointing team, the Cincinnati Bengals. Number 4, I went ahead and chose the New Orleans Saints. The New Orleans Saints were a borderline team last year for the playoffs. Many thought with Derek Carr in his second season as the Saints starter, and many of the roster being players that were expected to have swan songs, that maybe the Saints could make a run this year, especially with the fact that the Falcons were in discombobulation with the quarterback situation between Kirk Cousins and Michael Penix. The Panthers expected to be terrible. And the Buccaneers still having Todd Bowles as head coach, who obviously has a ceiling. Many thought that maybe the Saints can make a run at being the best team in the NFC South. Instead, they were the worst team in the NFC South. Despite winning their first 2 games by handily margins, the Saints really couldn't go anywhere after that point. They fired Dennis Allen after 9 games. Darren Rizzi takes over, leads them to 3 wins, but then fizzles out. Just nope. And the big problems for the Saints were 1, injuries, and 2, zero consistency from any part of the Saints. And unfortunately for the Saints, it doesn't look like the nightmare is over, because they're not going to be able to bring in talent because there's $70 million over the cap space. The head coaching search has turned out to be a complete disaster. You have a general manager who has no idea what he's doing. But he thinks he knows everything about the business because he got lucky simply by having Drew Brees and Sean Payton, yet he wants to take credit for everything. It's a mess in the Saints organization that is just going to get worse before it gets better for the Saints. If you're a Saints fan, well, first off, I know you're a diehard because of how bad the Saints are. But secondly, it's about to get way worse. New Orleans Saints, 4th most disappointing team in the NFL for 2024, but that's the least of their problems right now. Number 3, I went ahead and put the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jaguars were a borderline team last year, went 9-8. It was expected that if Trevor Lawrence could stay healthy, then the Jaguars would take another leap forward. But that wasn't the case. Trevor Lawrence was injured for most of the season. But even when he did play, he wasn't as good as he was in years past. The team just completely fell apart between injuries and bad coaching. There was many points where you can tell that the team had given up on head coach Doug Peterson, who was then fired after the season was over. It didn't help that Trent Baalke was the GM, and he ultimately had to be fired too. Just a not good season for the Jaguars. And a team that was expected to make the playoffs was one of the worst teams in the NFL. So that's why I have the Jaguars as the third most disappointing team in the league. At number 4, I put the New York Jets. The New York Jets last year were one of the worst teams in the NFL, but they did also have one of the worst quarterbacks in the form of Zach Wilson. With Aaron Rodgers coming back and healthy, it was believed that maybe the Jets would be the team to beat in the AFC East. Instead, it was shown that Aaron Rodgers was just way past his prime. No consistency on the field. The Jets really couldn't get it done. Robert Saleh was the first head coach to be fired. The guy they selected to be his interim wasn't much better. Heck, may have actually been worse than Robert Saleh. And it was just a terrible year for the Jets. And it looks, again, like it's not going to get any better because a report came out this morning that Aaron Rodgers doesn't want to return to the Jets. So head coach Aaron Glenn is going to have a lot on his hands to try and rebuild for the Jets going forward. And that's why, because they were expected to be a borderline playoff team with Aaron Rodgers at QB, which turned out to be one of the worst teams in the NFL, that's why I ranked the Jets as the second most disappointing team in the league. And at number 1, I have the Cleveland Browns. The Cleveland Browns were a playoff team last year. It was a team that was expected to finally define itself, and a quarterback that was finally expected to define himself, Deshaun Watson. Deshaun Watson was finally expected to be a great QB, finally show the same side of him from Texas that led him to have one of the biggest contracts in the NFL. Instead, it was proven why the Browns signing Deshaun Watson to as big of a contract as they did was one of the worst free agency decisions possibly in the history of the NFL. Yes, even worse than that infamous Albert Haynesworth free agent deal, although that could be skewed a little bit due to recency bias. But no doubt that the Browns signing Deshaun Watson is going to go down as one of the worst free agency deals of all time. Couldn't stay healthy, and when he was healthy, he was terrible. Browns couldn't get any consistency. The team fell from a wild card playoff berth last year. This year, they're having the second pick in the draft. Just an all-out terrible season from the Browns when they were expected to be a borderline playoff team again. And the problem for the Browns is, when will this nightmare end? Because you've had this big contract for Deshaun Watson with this big buyout of guaranteed money, to where you can't really release him or trade him. If you release him, that causes too big of a cap hit when you're already the second worst cap situation in the NFL. But at the same time, nobody's going to want to take on his contract because of how badly structured it is and how terrible he's been. Regardless of if you get a new quarterback this season, Deshaun Watson's going to be on the roster for at least this year, possibly the next year. Just all this dead money that you forced yourself to agree to. But anyway, that's why the Browns are the most disappointing team in the league and probably the most dysfunctional. So that's my top 5 list. Number 5, Cincinnati. Number 4, New Orleans. Number 3, Jacksonville. Number 4, the New York Jets. And number 1, Cleveland. I'll have a sequel video coming out tomorrow once we know the result of the Super Bowl. Thank you very much.